All right, so, well, hi everyone. I'm very glad to be here today. We're going to be talking about making our code more readable. I know that recently there's been a lot of fancy things people have been talking about, JavaScript, CentOS, and so on. Today is more in the back to basics category. But I think it's good to keep a close eye on that kind of stuff. No one is against virtue, but knowing why virtue is good can invite us to make even more efforts towards our goal. So like I said, I'm really glad to be here. DIGFM is something I enjoy usually as a participant. I was not necessarily envisioning me ending up speaking, and I'm still not quite sure how it all happened. Eric reached out to me like 2 days ago to see if I could speak today, and he mentioned something, but secretly, I suspect whoever was supposed to speak today went to a party last week that got a bit too wild and could not be with us today. So in any case, I'm very thankful I get to present today and about a topic I care about. I've been doing FileMaker consulting since 2005, and I started Accolade Plus Accolade in 2019. My company's tagline is communication is everything, and everything is communication. And this applies to code also. So our main objective today will be to push comments down our list of tools we use when wanting to make our code more readable. I'll argue that comments are one of the biggest threats to making our code more readable. They're too easy to use and rely on. It can almost be perceived as our only tool. I'm not completely against comments, but I believe there are some reflexes we have that may be worth fighting off. So our agenda today will be, well, first, why is it we should be keeping this close to our hearts? And then we'll look into naming a great tool that we can use to make our code more readable. And then we'll look at some more tools. We'll discuss comments, because if they're not all that bad, let's make sure that we know how to use them and when to use them, what to use them for. We're going to discuss some gadgets, and then parting notes and discussion as time allows. That said, feel free at any time to interrupt, unmute yourself, ask a question, send a comment, anything, or in the chat. Yeah, I think especially in a group like we have here, I expect some great input from people in the crowd. So that a lot of what I will be covering is subjective. Okay, so let's not think that I'm putting it out there as a universal truth. There is no such thing. Okay, and mostly based on my own practice, and it is ever evolving. And I hope for you it is the same. You know, that nothing is set in stone. There is content that is derived from things that were shared in the community, and sometimes it's hard to even trace where it came from. So if there is someone who's not getting proper credit, I hope you will be forgiving me for that. Yeah, some of the concepts are long-lasting in that field, I may say. And I will be borrowing from Jerry Robbins' DevCon presentation from back in 2014. And I hope you like quotes. Speaking of quotes, so here is one. All relationships are based on trust. Customers, employees, partners, where you eat, what you eat. It applies to code also. How can we trust something we cannot understand? How are we going to understand it if reading it is not making that easy? So did I mention I was going to use quotes? Here is one from Martin Fowler. He says, any fool can write code that a computer can understand. Good programmers write code that humans can understand. In other words, a programmer's job isn't just to make things work, but to make things make sense. And that's a whole different thing. And we have Jessica here saying, one man's crappy software is another man's full-time job, and that full-time job is not fun. No one wants that kind of job security. So why we should care? Obviously, well, for others, okay, people will be in contact with our code, and they will be touching it, changing it, and so on. So let's just make it easy for them. You know, if they have to scratch their head and be cursing at us, not so good. So and the other thing is obviously for ourselves. Basically, things change, and sometimes we may be 2 years later, a year later, 2 months later, a week later, the very next day, and there are things that we no longer recall, and we don't want to have to go from memory. Memory is not really that reliable. I'm sure it depends on everyone, but in between relying on memory and relying on just reading the code and being like, oh yes, this is what it's doing. So I would prefer relying on something I just read. So so yeah, we've all been in that position where we looked at something that we wrote and we were like, well, what was I thinking? You know. So let's see how it is we can shape things that we may be scratching our head less often. So what happens if we cannot, sorry, I'm getting a request to annotate content. I think I'm going to decline that for now, but if someone wants to tell me more about that, the chat would be a good option, I guess. So in so yeah, what happens if code cannot be trusted or understood? Well, a couple of things actually. When we look at maintenance and updates, if we end up in a situation where we'd say, well, you know what, better if I don't touch that. You know, it's not really the space we want to be in. It's not really code that is alive. It's more code that ends up on a shelf, gathers dust, and eventually we pull the plug on it. So same thing. Is it working, or how is it working? I don't know. It's not going to be reassuring for anyone to hear that. So let's make sure that when we are asking ourselves those questions, the answer is easy to get to. Okay. And lastly, there's the let's start over or Ikea effect, because basically code can be working just fine, or more than just fine. It can be working perfectly and still fall victim to not being understood and not trusted. So what happens then? Well, we say, you know what, I can do this. I'll just code it, you know. And then the thing we forget about that is with this comes testing and debugging and everything else that goes with that. So I'm sure you notice the difference here in working perfectly with, I'm not saying you can have good code that fall victim to that, because good code is code that you trust, and you wouldn't pull the plug on code that you trust. So another good way for code to be losing trust is when comments are inconsistent with what the code does. Comments can be a lot of maintenance. And I don't know if you've noticed on my presentation slide about myself, but I'm lazy, okay, in a good kind of way. There's good lazy and bad lazy, so we'll discuss that a bit. The IKEA effect is not something I invented. It's not just a play on words or something like that. It actually exists. If you look it up, there is a Wikipedia page for that, and it's the effect that that we get when we're basically putting too much value on something simply because we contributed to putting it together or to create it or partially created it. So for IKEA, it's about furniture. Okay, so but for code, it's the same can apply. You're not gonna you're gonna overvalue something that you created yourself. There's also other effects that come into play. One is the mere exposure effect, where people tend to develop a preference for things just because they're familiar with it. And also that's very natural. I mean, if I get to choose in between this black box that I know nothing about and something that I'm familiar with, that I know how it works and so on, I'd rather rely on the thing that that I'm familiar with. It doesn't mean that it's better. It just means that I'm familiar with it. And the last effect is the Dunning-Kruger effect. And it's an effect where people with a low ability at a task tend to overestimate their own ability. So if you're not an expert familiar with a given topic, basically you think that that stuff is easier than it really is. And that is something that clearly applied to me when I figured I could put together the material for this presentation. So let's see here. Where do we spend our time? Well, we have Robert C. Martin, who says something that I was floored to hear about. He says we spend just about 10 times the amount of time we spend writing code, reading code. So for every hour we write code, we're reading code for 10 hours. For every 10 hours we write code, we are reading for 100 hours worth of code. And that's a chunk of time. Let's make sure that if we spend that much time, even if he's off by say half of it, you know, if it's 5 to 1, it still is crazy numbers. So let's make sure that that time is time well spent. That we don't spend more time than we have to reading, and that when we are reading, we get from it exactly what we want. Something else that is interesting to know is that programming languages are taught in ways that are very different from regular languages, meaning if you take a class of, say, Spanish, French, German, anything, you'll be introduced to basic concepts, grammar, and so on. And then people are not going to ask you, okay, now go write a novel. You know, they're going to say, go and watch a movie, go read a book, listen to a conversation, listen to radio, and so on. So you're exposed to that language. With programming languages, somehow it's like we flipped everything on its head, saying, okay, well, here's the basics, and now go write stuff. You know, it starts with hello world. Anyway, so here we have a quote from Steve McConnell saying, if you think you don't need to make your code readable because no one else ever looks at it, let's make sure you're not confusing cause and effect. And I think that's food for thought. Sometimes we're like, yeah, I'll be just fine. You know, no one else needs to look back at that. Well, let's look into naming and why naming is a good thing. Obsessing about it is a good thing. I don't want anyone to worry that I'd be forcing a naming convention or anything like that. This is not what it's about. But let's make sure we have naming conventions. But naming itself is something to be looked into. So Phil Carlton says there's only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things. I know nothing about cache invalidation, and I'm sure it's a nightmare. Now, naming things is just we would think it's easy, but it's not. It's hard. Naming things the right way is hard. So naming is our most powerful tool. Naming is what we can use to be understood. And being designers, naming shows our intent and tells a story. So how should we go about naming things in our work? Well, first, I would suggest let's be good parents. And with this in mind, FileMaker has always been making things easy for us to rename using the internal IDs and so on, so that it would we would have next to no work, to do if we rename something. I would say that feature is something we should rely on less and less, because when we think to ourselves, oh yeah, I can rename that later. Well, first thing, later tends to be even later than you envision. And second thing is just a bad habit. If we think of it as like with our own children, we wouldn't rename them. We wouldn't say, hey, Fred, happy birthday. You're 5. Now from here on, we're going to call you Simon because Simon is so much such a better name than Fred. No one would do that. Okay, so let's just make sure that we come up with the proper name for things from the get-go. Renaming things can just break our stuff. Okay, so we have more moving parts now, and if we are renaming a script, that script may be used by a server-side schedule. It could be used in a URL and so on. So those things are not going to get updated magically for us. You have to go back in there and change those calls. So you're better off if you figured the right name in the first place. Good news is we name stuff all the time. There's a lot of elements that we're called to name. They go from custom functions, layouts, layout objects, and so on. So we get to practice a lot, and they say practice makes perfect. What a name is not. Well, I would argue a name is not an abbreviation. Okay, and I know that drop downs can be narrow at times, but I would say let's try to avoid abbreviations as much as we can. They require way too much context to be understood. So if you just take a given word, and you ask some friends to say, how would you abbreviate that word? Well, chances are you're going to get different answers from people who have the full word. Now take that and flip it around. Take an abbreviation and ask your same friends, what's the full word? The difference are going to be even more different than what you had the first time around. So abbreviations are not a way to save time. If you think that they're going to save you time because you're saving keystrokes on your keyboard, look elsewhere for time-saving measures. This is not going to save you time. It's going to cost you more time reading things back. So a name is also not a shorthand or an acronym. I'm saying that because I got into a system once where the developer before me had the idea to call a custom function, and the custom function was called GSP. And I was like, well, what's that? And then I went into the definition, and it was just a straight get script parameter, and now I was stuck in a system where just about a bunch of native functions were called with names that were obfuscating what it really was, just because the person before me didn't want to write it in full, And so there's plenty of options for you there. FileMaker IntelliSense is now helping with that. There's also a bunch of software that exists that will expand keystrokes for you. So let's make sure that we're not using any type of shorthands. And lastly, a
Pie.
name is not part of just an arbitrary series. Okay, so if you get things like that, that's the bad lazy. Okay, and we've seen this, you know, stuff like XYZ, new, old, and then new to. So let's take the time that we need and name things the right way. Okay, a name should be pronounceable, and it should be easy to search for it using your favorite DDR tool. So let's look at some examples. The bad guys. Okay, we have variables mostly. So $PC, prodcat, I'm not going to pronounce that. $D with elapsed times and days and comment next to it, the GSP that I spoke about, and then a full-fledged calculation. So now let's replace this with something a bit better. So if we take PC and we say now, who would have guessed it could be product category, you know? Well, you'd need the context to be able to know, okay, PC means product category, and you're going to be going through the code and fetching for whatever you can that's going to give you that context. Let's spell it out. You know, that's the easy part. And now that I've said that PC stands for product category, I'm sure if we look at the next one for Prodcat, everyone's going to know that it stands for product catalog, right? Because there's only one way that something can be expanded into something else. No. So again, let's make sure that we're explicit, that we spell things out. And that variable I didn't want to pronounce earlier, who would have guessed it stands for filtered student names? No one, I would guess. So the next one, why not use the comment to name the variable this way? Because if we think, well, it's more readable, you know, the comment is right there. I'm going to ask, well, are we going to put the comment each and every time we use the variable? Because if not, we're asking the reader to hunt for that information. And if we are going to put it every time we use the variable, well, we might as well just name the variable this way. So for get_parameter, parameter, I spoke about that before. And the last one is not really about naming because all that's there is native in FileMaker. But here we can introduce a custom function that will be shorter to read. And just as we read that custom function, we know what we expect out of it. We know what it's going to output. So let's make sure that when we read, it flows, you know, and we're not having to stop and parse out things for what's into the details of something to be evaluated. All right, so general recommendations. If we have booleans, let's start our name with something that says is or has, like is paid. If we're talking about arrays or lists, let's use plural. If we have functions or scripts, we should expect to have a verb and a target. And for just about everything, it's all about consistency, consistency, consistency. Let's make sure that if we are using upper characters for something, then we stick to it. If we are using prefix, and let's not switch it into a suffix. If we are standing by something that goes get and set, let's not switch for read and write, and so on and so on. Like within a single system, we want to have that consistency. Let's be specific, let's be explicit. Basically, no one wants to guess what we were thinking, not even ourselves. So if you don't have time to do it right, when will you have time to do it again? So it applies to naming too. Let's be lazy. Let's not do stuff twice. Bad names are like raindrops. A single one is not going to ruin your day, but you're never going to receive a single raindrop. The first one only tells you there's more to come. So here I'm sharing something personal. When JSON was introduced in the in FileMaker, I liked it so much. I started naming my variables the way we see a JSON path, and so it would give something like invoice.bill2.zipcode. And you may like that, you may not like that. The one thing I'm going to say though is let's not extend that into field names, because the data API is using field names as keys in the resulting JSON. And having periods in the keys of your JSON is just, it spells trouble. So here we go. So let's just see if there's anything in the chat or if there's anything that should be mentioned. Okay, looks good. Yeah, so let's look into some more tools. Naming is not everything, you know, but if all we have is a hammer, everything will look like a nail. And the hammer here is not naming. Hammer here is comment. Okay, so here's what I'm going to make my next t-shirt if we meet again soon. Good code is like a good joke. It needs no explanation. And to achieve that, first, let's avoid magic numbers. Now, what's a magic number? So if we have a loop construct like this here, okay, it's very basic, loop, exit loop. If we have a counter greater than 52, then we do some stuff and we increment the counter, and that's it. Greater than 52, 52 what, right? We can totally make this much clearer if we simply have the same thing and say, well, we're going to cast a variable and say, okay, we count equals 52. And then we have the same thing where the exit condition uses the variable instead of just 52. So now we know we're looping on weeks, you know, and we couldn't have a different thing where we say same loop, you know, just let's change the variable name for deck size. And then we know we're going to be looping on cards, you know? So not everything is a magic number, okay? Zeros and ones and stuff like that, you don't have to spell out. If we have things that are commonplace, like how many hours in a day, how many minutes in an hour, those kind of things, if you're rounding to 2 digits, you don't have to just set it to a precision or something like that. It's clear enough. But one example that really stood out to me was something I came across, and there were two functions. One was both of them were using the number 151, you know, and the first function was called "Have I caught them all?" and the other function was called "How many more do I have to catch?" And the reveal was that there was a variable where the 151 was put into it, and the name of that variable was total Pokemon. And then the functions all of a sudden made sense. So let's avoid magic numbers. Also, let's go easy on negation, okay? It's just a different mindset. There's a strong contrast. We're not used to be reading things spelled out this way all the time. So I don't know if you've ever felt like hide when should be show when instead, but basically it's just, like I said, it's a different mindset. So it can be leading us astray, both for the intent and the result. So let's make sure that when we use it in a way that's going to be readable and intuitive. Let's use indentation. Okay, if I take a calculation that is very basic, just trying to concatenate first name and last name, it's not that it's unreadable, you know, but this over here is just going to be clearer. You know, we have better spacing. It invites us to have things in pair. And the comment here is not there to tell us that it's the default result. The comment here is there to preserve the pattern that we're going to have things in pairs. So indentation is good, but not always. So if you have, say, a script or a calculation where you end up nested too deep, well, let's revisit. Let's see how we can make sure that we're not going to be asking the reader to figure out, wait a minute, where am I here? Because it feels like I'm getting dizzy just looking at this. White space in calculations. Now, what we have on the left, again, is very trimmed down, okay? And it's not by itself a problem, but adding the white space to see, again, the pairs standing out is always gonna help. And here, it's oversimplified because we have things that are very short by themselves, but if you were to have something where the calculation would wrap over the next line, or maybe you would have semicolons within what you're trying to evaluate for either the test or the result, then it can lead to some confusion. So with all of that, just a few carriage returns are going to help to make the pairs stand out. White space in script. I mean, it's been for ages now that we do have white space in scripts, so let's use that. It invites us to divide things and let them breathe a little bit, and we can now put a comment in there to name the section. And we saw that naming is really a good thing. So let's make sure that we use it. Custom functions. Custom functions are really great. They're dry, so whenever you do an update, it applies everywhere. But most of all, I would say you get to choose the name. So maybe you're going to be picking up custom functions from the community online on the website. Look at the way it's called, and I would say feel free to rename it. You know, the FBI is not going to come knocking at your door saying, "Why is it you're renaming this this custom function?" The author obviously meant for the name to be different. They may ask you where you were last week, but not about custom functions. That I can pretty much be sure about. So feel safe to rename, unless we're talking about something that is widely reused in the community, and then you'd be coming across segments of code that you would want to just copy paste in your solution. And if you didn't preserve the original name, then it's going to break. But otherwise, consider making the function your own and renaming it. Also, let's use let statements. If we have something here that is just basic again as a calculation, it's just trying to figure out what's the extended cost for an invoice line item. If we simply wrap this into a let statement, then we know right away that it's outputting the extended cost. And if I want to see how it comes to that, then I can simply unwrap one level at a time how it's being calculated. So again, here 100, 1, 2, those are not magic numbers. And when using let statements, just take a moment to see what it is you're aiming for, because at times it can be not performing as well as a calculation. Sometimes it can outperform the matching calculation. So you have to pay attention into how it's built and what gets called and recalled and not, and so on. So here we go. Now, if we look into our calls for say plugin calls or script parameters, I would say let's try and avoid sending in null values. You know, if you're looking at something that's a send mail, and you have a plugin call that looks like that. And I say, hey, James, could you add a BCC in there? Well, James got to go and look at the actual definition of the call to see where the BCC fits. You can't just right away say, yeah, I'll do that. And I mean, unless he's the one who built the function in the first place, maybe, and he built it just last week. So if we go with something like this, where everything is already defined, it could be that BCC is going to be empty, but either way, he simply has to make sure that before the call, the variable ends up having whatever value we want to have in there, and then he's good to go. He doesn't even have to change the actual call itself. Same goes if we have something that is position-based for script parameters. We could have something, and again, we're saying this is very simple. We can almost guess everything here. We're adding a phone to a contact, and then so we have an ID, we have something, we have the we say it's a cell phone number, and then we have the actual number. So if I keep asking James for what's that second parameters, now he's got to go into the script and figure out how it's being used to know what to put in there. Whereas if we just use our variables, it's spelled out. We right away, just by looking at it, we know what to pass in. It's expecting a contact ID, then oh, that is a flag to determine if it's the primary phone or not. And then we have the phone type and the phone number. And here with the phone, just looking at the data, we can pretty much assume, okay, cell is a type of phone, and the actual data is the phone number itself. But sometimes not just null values, but even actual data is not going to be that revealing about how it's going to be used on the other end. So I would say variables will always be better than sending something that has null values or even straight values. Let's avoid using perform find restore. I think when we're reading a script or reading code at large, just anything that will be breaking the flow is something we should try and avoid. And having to go onto a step and double click and go through dialogues is clearly something that will break the flow. So it obfuscates things, and chances are we're going to start making assumptions because we don't want to go into that dialogue, and if our assumptions are wrong, well, then bad stuff is going to happen. So I would say, let's just, again, spell things out. Let's just make sure that we are using the script steps that are going to mimic the user behavior that would build the query for us. So we can say set field, new record, omit, and whatever else we need in there to make sure that we can just read the script through and not have our flow be interrupted. Now, since we're talking about script and variables, well, when we are looking at the actual script, let's make sure that we are initializing it, initializing our variables early. Okay, we don't want to have it something where on row 50 of the script, there's something that says, okay, if get script parameter, blah blah blah, and then we're not expecting that to be sent in, because if we have that, then the next thing we know, someone will have called our script without even sending in the parameter, and again, bad stuff will happen. And then it's going to what will happen is going to depend on how much error trapping you're doing in your script. But all in all, it's just about making sure that things are easy for whoever comes next for the reader. So some people will use the script name to show the parameters that are expected by the script itself, and that makes it look like a function. I tend to shy away from that just because there is a character limit for the names that I believe to be 100 characters. But if you want to adopt that, feel free to do that and see that it gives you more readability. So here's a quote that most everyone knows, I think, and I'm not including it in here for its comic relief. I came across something that surprised me about this quote, and that not everyone knows. And here it is. The original quote says, "Code for readability," and also it dates back to 1991, not 2012, not 2005, not it dates back to 1991. So readability has been something to be mindful about for a good while, and even prior to that. And in all likeliness, it's going to keep being something we need to care about and watch ourselves for the foreseeable future. So yeah, let's look at all that. Joel Spolsky says it's harder to read code than to write it, and I think this ties really well into one of the first quotes we had in the presentation, where we said any fool can write code that a computer can understand, but good programmers will write code that humans can understand. So this basically says the same in a shorter version. And Joel knows quite a bit about coding. I think he's the founder of Trello and also co-founder of Stack Overflow, if I'm right. So general rules and recap. Let's explain our magic tricks. You know, secrets are not welcome. There are no bonus points for being sneaky, clever, or fitting all our code in a single line. That's the kind of stuff that is going to get us to scratch our head the next time we look at it. Okay, saving keystrokes is really not the way to go. We think we're saving time, but we're not. It's going to end up costing us more time. Good naming is more than half the battle. Let's avoid magic numbers, use white space and indentation without nesting too much. Custom functions and let statements are our friends. We should avoid values in our call. We never want to make the reader guess, and we should always spell it out for both find request and variable initializations. So by the end of all this, you should have your own writing style, and your own does not mean that it's unique. It just means that you're completely familiar with it. If a reader looks at your code, at some point, what comes next in your code will be predictable because of the trends and patterns it follows. The way things are will become the way things are will become what the reader expects. And that is when you can say mission accomplished. So a couple things about comments, because they're not all that bad. Here we have Ron saying, code never lies, comments sometimes do. Code can only do what we tell it to do. Comments are not for the computer, they're for us. They drive nothing about your code. Every time you write a comment, if it is about what the code does, if the code is updated, your comment is at risk of being outdated. And that is really critical to me. Again, saying I'm lazy, you know, I don't want to have to do more maintenance than I have to. Comments that tell you what the code does, they're heavy maintenance. So what is it we're given in FileMaker for comments? Well, we have field comments. We have script comments that can be multi-line or not. On the support for multi-line is not even across all platforms. I think we have support on Mac, but I'm not quite sure that on Windows it's like that. I think it gets truncated to only the first line. We have end-of-line comments and block comments, and we can also add notes to our relationship graph. Well, good comments will tell us why and not how, or not be basically telling us what the code is already telling us, because we should be able to read the code, okay? So it should tell us the overall intent and For variables, you can use comments to let you know what it is you're going to be sending in, if there are any restrictions or limitations, like a range of valid entries or a unit of measure. Sometimes unit of measure could also be part of the name. So yeah, comments can be informative. They can be warnings for someone, for instance, who debugs your code. If you say, this perform script on server will run for about 5 minutes, and that's normal. That's not something you could guess by just reading the code. Okay, so putting that in there is a good way to be using comments. You can also use comments to put to-dos in your code, and just make sure that someone will come after and implement whatever to-do needs to be implemented, and remove the comment, because sometimes there are things that we say, oh yeah, we'll do this later, and then later never happens. So code can't explain why the program is being written and the rationale for choosing this or that method. Code cannot discuss the reason certain alternative approach were taken. So really, all of that is something that we should put into comment or into documentation, or comments can be well suited for that type of information. And Bertrand Meyer is saying incorrect documentation is often worse than no documentation. And that is not only because being misled is a complete waste of time, but more importantly, it's because it erodes the trust relationship we have with the code. And everything is about trust. So let's look at a few gadgets we can use. I would recommend putting in your backpack the following. So one is MBS. What I'm describing here is only for Mac. I know MBS can be for both Mac and PC, but what I'm describing here is only for Mac. And I know MBS is a paid product, but what I'm describing here is available for free. So it can check variable declarations, has custom syntax colorization, a bunch of things. Okay, if you want to do a find in a graph, well, it's going to let you do that. If you want to have your cursor set on a calculation parenthesis or bracket, it's going to highlight the matching one, opening and closing. If you are clicking in your script on an if and if, loop and loop, it's going to, again, highlight the matching opening or closing row. So it's really a great tool. And just for checking existing variables being declared, that saved my my skin a good number of times. Text expanding utility. Again, there is no reason not to use one. There are many options. Atex, I think, is like $5. So really, everyone should be having something like that. That's going to let them type something in and then have the resulting calculation put in there for them. I like to use it especially for, say, respecting the indentation into a case statement or a let statement, or when calling a JSON set function. So if you are working on both Mac and PC, I would say look for something that is cross-platform, because translating your little bits of codes into each is not something you're going to enjoy much. But yeah, just make sure you're using something like that. And lastly, a snippet holder. So Clip Manager is the one I'm using, but there's also other available options. One bonus quickly, there is an application called MonoDraw that is available on Mac only. If you are on Windows, I would point to the URL at the bottom that is called texttick.com. Basically, you can think of this as Visio meets ASCII art. Okay, And because everything that it outputs is really text-based, then you can take that and draw your workflow or whatever you want to draw, basically, and then put it onto your relationship graph. Or you could also put it into your multi-line comment if you're on a Mac. But again, on a PC, the multi-line comment is not going to display well, I think. Although if you're using it for the relationship graph, it's gonna work well. So, all right. Parting notes. Time to say goodbye. We have. I'm sorry for not pronouncing the name of the author here, but we're saying there are only two kinds of programming languages. Those people always bitch about, and those nobody uses. So if you think the problem is coming from FileMaker, think again. Your code won't be more readable if you write it in another language. This is not what it's about. If you feel like the problem is coming from there, well, maybe the problem might be behind the keyboard. So try and look again. Also, here is a nice parody. If you Google for how to write unmaintainable code, you're going to come across this URL here. And it is a very hilarious read, but at the same time, it can be very inspiring, because if you just about take every statement in there and flip it around, then it's a great guide about recommendations for what to do to make your code both more readable and more maintainable. And with that said, the only thing I have left to say is, now let's go and write code that others will trust. All right. So I think that's all I have here. Maybe one more thing I could show when I was talking about MonoDraw is the actual application itself. And I think I was having this here. So basically, like I said, it's kind of like Visio. You have your boxes, you have connectors, and if you drag your stuff around, well, the lines will keep moving along, so that everything makes sense. And then you can take this and bring it into FileMaker. And if you want to go have something on your graph that has the same workflow, all you have to do is create a note. You come in here, and in here it's going to look like a total mess, okay? Because this here is not using a monospaced font, but you can tell for the display to use a monospaced font, and then you choose the size, the color, and the background, like any note, and you end up having this. So I think it's a great way to have documentation that is right there where we need it, instead of having us run around and look for a separate document, because there's no way we could put like a PDF in here. And if someone is curious about what it might look like in a script, well, this is a script step that is just a comment. And in there is the same content that is, again, all text-based. So yeah, you could use it in different places and get something that looks like that. So I think with that, I would stop sharing, and we can see if there's anyone wants to comment, have questions, and we can look at the chat and so on.
Thank you very much, Robert, for your presentation. I always walk away thinking about trust, and especially if like in other languages where there's large communities that build libraries, or they share code in larger ways, and people test it, and lots of people test it. Trust is built in different ways, right? So you using it and seeing the results are good and it's fast and efficient, etc. But also having the fact that the code is being used by so many people is also extremely valuable, and it builds a lot of trust, I think.
Yes, yes, I couldn't really say much more. If there is one thing to take away from the whole presentation is really everything is about trust. Because if you can't trust the code, then the next thing that's going to happen is it's going to end up in the trash.
There's a couple of questions here. Do you have any suggestions about script templates, documentation at the beginning of a script?
I don't have anything specific. So I know that it's the kind of thing where everyone will have their own preference and styles and so on. So my presentation is not aiming to set standards or anything like that. It's more about making sure that we are mindful about those things, that we are basically more aware than we are. Because if we don't know why those things are good, then chances are we're not going to make that much of an effort. You know, we're going to say, yeah, sure, I want my code to be readable, but it's gonna be like just that statement. No one wants to make code that is unreadable. But if you know that making code that is unreadable is going to lead to very, very bad results, then you're going to spend more time looking into, okay, well, what it is I should be putting into my header of a script to make sure that whenever someone else comes after, they can find their way easily.
Actually, if you don't mind, if I say something about templates, and one thing you said earlier, and it caught my attention, and I really liked the way you phrased it about that case statement where you said the default result, and the point was to preserve the indentation, preserve the pattern of the function, rather than say this is where the default goes. And I think that that applies to script flow too. So if you can establish a really common pattern in the way your scripts flow, for example, the way you do error handling or the way you do logging, maybe you centralize that at the end of the script. And this is not like a prescription about how to script or anything. It's just if it's consistent within the system, then people can get used to your pattern of doing things, which makes your code a lot more readable. And then comments kind of come into that in a really useful way. When you find yourself in a situation where you have to break the pattern, you can put a comment for why. And your comment's not explaining what your code's doing, but it's explaining why you're doing something different than they've seen every other time. And that can be really useful.
Yes, and I'm really glad that you are talking about the part where if you break the pattern, make sure that you make a mention about it, because I would say the one danger if you have something where everything is roughly shaped the same way, at some point that could make it seem to your eye like you're not really reading anymore, because you see that pattern and it is the same, and you're gonna actually, your eye will be injecting things that may not be there, you know. So I think code reuse is really good and great. Making sure that everything has the same shape all the time. I'm not sure that I would necessarily go down that path. There can be benefits there. I don't have like studies of pros and cons or anything like that. I would just say let's be mindful of if everything looks the same, then at the end of the day, when you're trying to debug, maybe you're gonna skip over a couple of things that that may not quite be the way they should be, but because you're so used to see that type of a structure, then you're going to be numb to it kind of way. So I see someone is pointing to FileMaker standards for things like commenting and what the people who were involved into that, I think Matt Petrosky and a good number of other developers, the contributions there are really, really great. They can be somewhat dated, but I think even if so, like we said, there are concepts that will go through time and be preserved very well. And I think there's a great deal of content over there that is really in that category.
Robert, there was a question earlier from Jay that was asking, you've worked a bit with Claris Connect. How does the coding environment and question of coding documentation readability compare with FileMaker?
I haven't worked much with Claris Connect, not to the point that I'd be able to comment about coding, documenting, and having comments. The way I think of Connect is things are really trimmed down, you know, like Lego blocks and so on. I'm sure there are times where it can be a bit confusing to see what happens and why and so on, and especially if we get into error handling and those kind of things. It's to me, it still is a new space, so I'd be it would be difficult for me to comment in a meaningful way. Don't know if that's a pun, but anyway.
Okay. And then Tim had another question. Do you recommend overall app documentation to be included in documentation to help support developers?
Well, I would say yes, as much as we can. Let's make sure that the documentation is where the developer will be, which is in the code. Okay. If it's not there, it may be elsewhere. What's going to keep that together? How is it going to be bound together? Some people will have comments that point to a separate location. It could be a URL to a knowledge base. It could be a path to a document that's stored on a drive somewhere. So there are different ways about this, but for sure, as much as we can have something that's right there, that's going to let the developer know the documentation exists, then the more likely he is to actually turn to it. Because if not, then maybe it's just going to stay where it is. And even if he's aware that it exists, it doesn't mean that he's going to make the extra step to go and fetch for it, you know. And that works for both consulting and updating. Okay, so as much as we're able to have everything be, like I said, where the developer is, and that's going to be in the code, then that's the best, as much as I can think.
Cool. And if anybody has any other questions, feel free to unmute yourself to ask Robert directly.
So Tony White's suggestion to prefix let variables?
That was a shout out to FM standards. Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
FM standards. I picked that up from that, and it's a nice visual differentiation. Hey, Robert, again, having seen the presentation 5 times, it is an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
Let me see if I can throw some interesting stuff into the mix. People make changes to code. Sometimes I see a lot of comments at top. We do comments in line. Anyway, I'm just throwing it out there. I so often I see like sequential comments, and we're lazy. We just like make a change in the middle, and we just say like, "Hey, we commented out. You know, we'll comment out 3 lines, put 3 new lines in, and just say, hey, that's what changed. Let the code speak for itself."
You mean compared to, say, like a change history that would be at the very top of the script?
We'll just do it right exactly there. and let the code speak for itself. And we'll often, sometimes, not always, but sometimes be like, you want to know what we did? You see those 3 lines that were commented out? We commented and we replaced them like for refactors. And then a month later, we'll go back and rip out the code if it didn't blow up.
Huh. Now I don't feel bad for doing that.
Yeah, I think, again, that's the type of thing where there's not going to be one universal way of doing this. And for the change history, I mean, today we know that in FileMaker, it's not really possible for us to have, say, a code repo with commits, and then we'd have comments to the commit that details those kind of change, because that's really where it would be. And if we make comparisons with other environments, so some people will have preference to say, well, I don't want to be hunting in the script for the changes and have everything at the top. But at the same time, some people will be like, well, if I'm there and I don't even know that it has changed, and the comment that lets me know that it has changed is all the way up there. So either way, there's good and bad to both approach. There's not one universal way to do things, but tracking changes is really something to pay attention to, because it ties into stability. You know, if we have something that changed, well, were we sure that we had tested everything that would be impacted, yes or no? And from there, maybe we're going to have someone who reports, hey, this started misbehaving, you know, how come? And if it's difficult for us to track the changes, then it's difficult for us to pinpoint, well, how come last week it wasn't misbehaving and this week it starts misbehaving? So again, there's a bunch of questions around that, and one thing that I really like to see if anyone in here wants to share his opinion on this is there are opposing concepts where on one end you have say the Boy Scout attitude to say, well, every time you come across something, let's try and leave it in a better shape than it was when you came in, you know. And on the other opposite of the spectrum, you have something where people may say, well, for every intervention that you do, let's try and limit the footprint, because everything that you change, there's a ripple effect, and the less of that is usually better for stability purposes. So it's not always easy to make the judgment call to say, well, it looks like it's not the way it should be, but at the same time, it's working right now and no one is complaining about it. So if anyone wants to share on that specific topic, I think it can be a great discussion right there.
Well, I vote for the former, because some of my code's so old that it definitely has room for improvement.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. Go ahead, Tony.
We have, in many systems, we have it, if it ain't broke, don't fix it policy. And we will only refactor code if we're touching it. And if we're touching it, it's going to go through testing cycle of some, level of sophistication. So we'll double down and say, like, okay, we're going to implement this feature. It's going to be a change. And while we're at it, we will beautify it, simplify it at that moment in time. But if it's just a feature that's working, that looks horrible under the hood, we will often leave it alone.
Yeah, I mean, to add on to that, it's like there's a double-edged sword with FileMaker, in that it lets you build a lot of code very quickly, and you get results, and you can cruise very, very far down the highway and leave a long trail of code behind you. I remember a presentation I saw by Mike Bostock, who's the author of D3, many years ago, that a quote that I always remember him saying, which is, I remove as much code as I add. And it really stayed kind of in my mind this idea that, yeah, like the Boy Scout going in and making, you know, it better every time. But I also, you know, want to bring up the topic that as systems that we support and build keep growing, you know, the term technical debt, I actually want to rename that and call it attention debt or something, because when you go into a system and have to look around, everything grabs maybe your attention for even a few seconds or something, and before you know it, it's like you're totally consumed in you're an avalanche of information, right? And you know, removing code and simplifying code is like a constant battle. uh, you know, that you want to keep things concise. New features come along in the community, new approaches that people develop, your skills get better, etc. These are always common things that help simplify your code, improve your code, etc. And I guess one last comment I'll make, and I'll post a link to a talk related to the D3 community, and this lady talking about developer tools and how developer tools need to also evolve and provide kind of data visualization components so that a developer who has to look at a lot of code can quickly grok at you know, some kind of visualization and spot the problem, understand the problem. So going back to this idea of patterns, you know, really important. And there's some really subtle things. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but in FileMaker script workspace, if you have like a script with 100, 200 steps, and some of the steps have problems, when you right click on the script and you say show problems, the problems light up in red. But even more subtle, on the scroll bar, you'll see where the red lines are to tell you that, hey, the problems are down here at this part of the script. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of you know, subtle visual data visualization, you know, things that we can build as developers in our solutions. But I think as the tools become, you know, if the tools can also mature that front and give us insight, that would really help us as developers.
There's, yes, very, very good. There's a lot in there. And I like what you said, and it got me thinking. I'm not too sure why, but it got me thinking about another concept that I feel is important, and it's the concept of flow. When I said when you're reading, I think it's because you said there are so many distractions, you know. When you're reading, you want to be reading the code, you know. Sometimes people feel like they're going to put in more comments and it's going to be more readable, and then there's almost more comments than there is code in there. And basically, if when you're reading, the comments are disrupting the flow of reading, then there's something bad there. You should be reading, and the comment should just fall in with the rest of the flow of whatever you're reading. So again, just about being, I guess, in the zone, you know.
Yeah, Vince hit on one of my favorite topics, which is technical debt, and mentioned the idea that as the platform matures, there's you know, code that was written perfectly with the tools that we had at the time can become technical debt, and just by virtue of the fact that FileMaker adds some features that make it possible to simplify code. One example, I was looking at the chat. Someone was talking about sort and the fact that it's a little bit invisible. The classic sort, the first one. There's another one, sort by field name, which affords you if you're only sorting by one field. I'm liking that one a lot, because, you know, just put them side by side, and if you're only sorting by one field, you can actually see the field. But that was introduced in 12. I've got a lot of code that was written pre-12, and so I was like, oh, wait a second. this could be more readable if I refactor that one sort script into the sort script that shows the field. It's a small thing, but it's a good thing.
Yeah, the sort dialog is really troublesome in some aspects, and who knows if it's gonna change. Like Tony said, we have a few options, but all in all, there's not always a magic answer for everything.
Was anybody
That's
notice?
true. That's no. Go ahead.
Has anybody noticed when you actually print out your scripts, they actually are much more verbose than you can actually read them on the screen, where they'll actually show the sorts and they'll show the finds that are buried beneath in the script steps. I'm kind of thinking that maybe a suggestion on a product suggestion to actually have that stuff become more verbose than it is right now.
I'm on the fence on that one, but again, you're free to submit it as a product idea and see if it gets traction. To some degree, I feel like the sort themselves, it's not that I want them to be spelled out. Every option, is it ascending, descending, and so on for how many fields. It's just I'd like to be able to alter it program with the code, and instead of having set in an option by hand. I don't know if some people recall when there wasn't even a dialog. You need to first run the sort and then add the sort step to your script for it to be capturing whatever sort was set in your found set. And I think it was the same for something else like the imports maybe, but that's from long ago.
Hey, Robert, there was a thread on community where someone was using the sort by field name gives you a little bit of that indirection kind of thing. You still have to name an object, but one thing I like is that using that, someone did a blog post, the people out of Boston, Columbia, I forget how to pronounce, but someone also, that company did a blog post on that feature. I saw it. I'm like, oh, wow, I'll adapt that to my coding patterns. Then someone on community, FileMaker community, Claris community, a couple of weeks ago was open sourcing an implementation for that bread and butter feature. And one thing that's cool about it is that you're working entirely in the layout space. You're not it's not part layout object design and part script. You're just working in one zone, so it's efficient in terms of the ability to deploy code in a single zone.
I kind of wish that it would stack, that every time you would call, that it would just add it to the existing order, and then you could have a script step that says, okay, well, get rid of it, and then whatever follows, like you start to stack over or something like that. But it's not the case right now. But but we have the tools that are there, and we can choose whatever option we feel like, and it's just I've stopped counting the times where I was with a customer and he would keep out of the blue adding fields to the sort order where I'm fearful that if I rely on something that can only have one, then the next time I need to add one, then I'll need to flush the step altogether and then go with the larger dialog. So maybe maybe I need to manage those fears in a better way, or I don't know. But we have many options, and that's a good thing.
Yeah, there's a lot already in the product to work with. We'll take more. We'll take more though.
Any last questions for Robert?
Yeah, Robert, are you going to make this presentation available or?
I can sure send a set of slides to Eric, and if Eric, you want to post that wherever appropriate, if it's on
that'd be great.
Yeah.
Actually, we post. There's a community thread post. You can probably just post it right there.
Okay, very good. So I'll make sure to do that, and I'm assuming all of this got recorded, and
Yes.
so it will also be on YouTube if someone wants to rewatch.
So these recordings, as well as this post on the community website, are they under a certain category or anything? Or do we just search by?
Somebody just posted the link to it. Sean just posted the link in the chat.
Thank you.
And DIGFM also has a YouTube channel with a custom channel URL, even, which is DIGFM.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank Robert for an incredibly short time span notice to come and present to the group. I know that you presented this many times, and a lot of people here also said it was a great presentation and would like to see it as an engaged presentation. So really appreciate you being able to jump in on short notice here and give this presentation to this group. So again, valuable information, and thank you for all the ideas that you put forward. And thanks again to Steve and Eric for helping organize all this.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I think it's a topic I care a lot about, and the more people can get exposure to it, I think we're all going to be winning from.
Yep. Cool. Eric, anything else to add?
No, I think that was great. Actually, I'm really glad we had you on this month, just in case we ended up combining with Portland and all those other groups next month. I don't know.
We'll see.
But yeah, this
will
turned
tell.
out great.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Cool.
it would have been kind of funny if we combined with the Portland group and they ended up hearing the same presentation again.
I think they would have suggested something different.
Well, we couldn't have that. All right, well, done. We can end the recording. And I'm going to save some of this chat too, just in case you guys want it later.